श्रियं सरस्वतीं गौरीं गणेशं स्कन्दमीश्वरम् ब्रह्माणं वह्निमिन्द्रादीन् वासुदेवं नमाम्यहम्. I'm reading a book called American Patent Law, A Business and Economic History by Robert P. Murgis. Robert Murgis is a professor of law at Berkeley Law. He has been writing about patents and patent law for over 30 years. The title of the book is American Patent Law, and the subtitle is A Business and Economic History. Over the years, a number of brilliant historical studies have appeared. The unprofessional but exceptionally devoted historian Edward Walsteed comes first in mind. His history of the earliest years of patent law, 1790 to 1836, is an invaluable resource. Many such prior historical research has been done on the topic of patent. Good as they are, none of these works try to cover the story of patents and patent law from 1790, the first Patent Act, to the present. I have often thought that the field could use such an overview. I know I would have been glad to have it for a number of research projects in the past. Not seeing such a book and armed with a fat file of historical materials collected over the years, I, to quote one historian describing another, found it necessary to refashion myself into something I had admired since my college days, a longue durée historian, that is, a long duration historian. So here they are. 1.1 Patents. Private rights as instruments of economic policy. The government, our government, grants patents, but patents are mostly sought, held, and used by private businesses. As acts of a sovereign state, each patent grant comes wrapped in all manner of policy issues to best serve society. How many patents should the government issue? What should they cover? How long should they last before expiring? And so on. But to their owners, companies and individuals, patents are only important insofar as they make some money or serve some other instrumental goal. Behind every patent is an owner who spent money to acquire it and who has or had some plan for it. In this book, I tell the story of American patent law from the vantage point of patent owners. Beginning with the first Patent Act in 1790, I lay out the general economic trends that form the background to invention and technological development. I describe some devices and techniques that characterize each era, technologies for harvesting and using wood in the earliest period, the new machinery of the mid-19th century, exemplified in fields such as woodworking and shoe-making machines, The technologies of large-scale industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, starting in steel and continuing to electrical power generation, telephony, and a host of other industries. Characteristic products of the industrialization era, including electric lighting, bicycles, and agricultural equipments. Then the chemical and auto industries from the 1920s on and ending with synthetic fibers, computer hardware and software, and biotechnology. Not concerning any particular industry, we touch on diverse fields such as farm equipment, coffin hardware, paper making, auto parts, and vegetable canning. The primary point of these case studies is to show something of the state of each industry at a given time, the development of a specific invention, the patenting of that invention, and how patents fit into the business enterprises that owned and deployed them. I share my curiosity about what kinds of patents inventors were getting and what kinds of business enterprises the inventors were part of. I show how they and their colleagues used patents to pursue business goals and how these patent strategies changed over time as industries and markets unfolded. The Congress rarely had any particular inventor or business in mind when they were debating and passing patent legislation, but the Congress had in mind an overall picture, some grants of government power to dispersed individuals who would raise money to create, improve, and implement new inventions. This was just one part of an overall governmental imperative to rapidly grow and develop the economy. Indeed, as we will see in this chapter and at length in chapter 2, invention patents were mentioned frequently through the first half of the 19th century as a cure for the shortage of labor in the new American nation. Patented inventions, it was hoped, would help to better leverage the labor of each working citizen. In parallel, liberal land grants, the land patent system, would attract immigrants, reducing the labor shortage on the supply side. Patents for land and inventions were thus important policy instruments in the early economic development state. Together they represent a distinctive economic strategy. Both invention and land patents intelligently leveraged the light but durable framework of the early federal government. In an era when the reach of visionaries such as Alexander Hamilton far exceeded the modest grasp of the new federal state, both types of patents injected federal development policy into all corners of the economy. But they did so by combining a small dose of federal power, the power to back up the federal right in court, with a large measure of private funding and initiative. Patents of both types were federally granted, bestowed, or conferred on qualified individuals by act of the government. The author describes the property strategy, the distinctive economic strategy comprising of invention and land patents, as democratic property strategy. Invention and land patents are unquestionably individual property rights. But why do I call policies behind these rights a democratic property strategy? The answer is breadth and reach. Both invention and land patents were granted to widely dispersed individuals in all corners of the country. Acquisition costs were low, and with work and good luck, a land or invention patent might form the nucleus of a profitable farm or business. Patents and technology promotion generally are rightly associated with Alexander Hamilton and the Report on Manufacturers. Yet, because invention patents were available to all comers and were inexpensive to acquire, they were much more congruent with early land development policy than with many of Hamilton's grand government-directed schemes. In fact, the patent world came in some respects to represent Jefferson's vision of small independent property owners making their own way without top-down constraints or guidance from the government. There never was any mention of a human inventor to go along with Jefferson's idealized portrait of the human farmer. Yet one could sometimes detect in the world of technology and Jeffersonian pattern of dispersed ownership spread among scattered small claimants. Because of this, the democratic property strategy imparted a Jeffersonian twist to the essentially Hamiltonian idea of promoting technological innovation. In keeping with the democratic spirit, acquisition costs for land and invention patents were intentionally kept low. Moderate acquisition costs were, however, accompanied by an additional requirement to gain full title. The applicant had to prove an expenditure of time and effort sufficient to demonstrate a good faith intention to develop the asset underlying the right, a piece of land or a new invention, as the case may be. Both land and invention patents and federal mining claims as well often have a two-stage vesting model. Stage 1 encourages a tentative legal claim, which is no more than a right to exert preliminary effort developing the asset. To secure actual title, land had to be improved. The would-be owner had to clear land, plant, harvest, etc., and also build a house, barn, or the like. This two-step procedure tries to steer expenditures and effort into actual development of the underlying asset instead of speculative buying with quick resale to others. Only after proof of good faith development efforts at stage 1 will formal title issue at stage 2. Why is speculation disfavored? What kinds of tactics are considered unproductive and so disfavored in stage 1? To answer that, a brief digression will help. 1.1.1 A short digression on rent seeking. When I say rent seeking, I mean the effort one expends to shape or capture government favors that add to one's profits. Government lobbying is typical. Strictly speaking, lobbying by itself is not an authentic sign of inefficiency, nor are the things lobbyists ask for. Inefficiency only results when a piece of legislation does nothing to stimulate additional production and so contributes nothing to greater economic output or the encouragement of beneficial activity. A change in this direction creates what economists call a rent, which generally means a profit-making opportunity. I use the term in a narrower sense. For me, it typically signifies a government-backed claim that is used by its holder to get money without contributing anything of real value. The seeking usually takes the form of spending time and money to acquire a valuable government favor. Rent seeking is almost always a pejorative in economic writing. That's because by definition the rent by itself adds little or nothing to productivity, and what is worse, the competition to capture the rent wastes money that might otherwise be spent on welfare-enhancing things like making new products or lowering the cost of existing ones. Rents don't help society in any real sense. They do not increase overall welfare, and yet they are valuable to their holders for use extracting value from other, typically productive economic actors. In the general non-IP literature, a classic example of a rent is a government import quota which restricts imports in favor of domestic producers. Assuming a robust market for imported products, there is real value in holding an official government license to import goods. If the quota is divided up into allotments, the number of imported products authorized by each allotment determines its value. The bigger an allotment's share of the total import quota, the more valuable that allotment is. The point to seize is the competition for the allotments. Each one is valuable more than one firm wants each one, so firms will spend time and money trying to increase the chance they'll get one and the size, proportion of the overall quota of any allotment they do get. The allotment is a rent. The competition for it is the seeking. Voila! Rent Seeking 101.
It is easy to see how the patent system might be used to generate rents that fit the same pattern. The patent on all soft drinks, for example, would give its holder enormous economic power. The makers of Coke, Pepsi, and a host of other soft drinks would spend big to capture such a rent. Whichever government agency were in charge of granting this soft drink patent would be inundated with lobbyists, each armed with elaborate arguments and campaign contributions to match. From an economic point of view, little good can come from this spending. Every dollar paid to lobbyists is a dollar less to spend on consumer discounts, product improvements, and the like. The asset being sought is a government-backed right to lower competition. The higher cost to consumers and the competition for this patent right would both contribute to economic waste. This, I hope, is a fanciful scenario. The legal requirements of patentability, that is, novelty, non-obviousness, adequate disclosure, and the like, were fashioned over time to prevent issuance of our hypothetical soft drink patent and anything like it. Yet there are still at times opportunities for seeking small rents under the rubric of the patent system. The legislative extension of a patent otherwise due to expire is a simple case. The extra profit that would be earned during the extension period is an attractive price, one that might well justify considerable expenditures for lobbying. A more common case is when an inventor tries to obtain a patent that covers more than he or she actually thought or disclosed, that is, an unduly broad patent. A number of patent requirements are in place to police this, but they do not always work as intended. Some overly broad patents slip through the system despite best efforts to stop them. These expansive patents, combined with features of patent litigation, create good conditions for rent seeking. Rents take the form of court decisions and private settlements that overvalue patents relative to the true merits of the inventions they cover. The extreme cases are the vague and overboard patents that should never have been issued in the first place. Owners of these patents, often firms specializing in patent assertion and litigation, sometimes use them to extract considerable profit from innovative and efficient companies. Aggressive use of patent system, including by those whose inventive contributions might be seen as minor, has been part of the patent system from the beginning. In the latter 19th century, there were enough specialist firms of this kind that they earned their own moniker, patent sharks. At the beginning of the 21st century, the popular name was patent troll. Whatever the era, whatever the label, the substance is the same. Patents are used not to further the traditional goal of promoting innovation. They act as a wasteful tax on true innovators, transferring money from active, productive firms to firms whose sole purpose is acquiring and making money from patents. 1.1.2 Productivity Enhancing Conditions on Property Grants. For federally granted rights, an applicant seeking title must first show some preliminary effort or investment. For land and mining claims, this means some minimum improvements, that is, a building, planting of fields, beginning of mining operations, etc. For an invention, the applicant must show enough research has been done to establish that the claimed invention is basically operative, that is, it meets the utility requirements, and that the inventor provides an informative description in the patent specification of the invention sufficient to teach others in the relevant field how the new invention works. Enablement requirement. These are finely balanced policies. The required initial investment separates a land or invention patent from a mere paper right. A speculator cannot just acquire rights on the cheap and quickly resell them to those willing to do the real development work. On the other hand, the upfront investment level cannot be set too high. Asking too much would put the rights out of reach of many people. The trick to policy design is to encourage and support many individuals to develop the underlying assets, that is, land and inventions, without transferring too much wealth to speculators and without excluding too many individuals of modest means from the chance to profit from their inventions. This, in a nutshell, is the democratic property strategy. The private ordering decisions that were enabled post-grant, and private control over whether and when to enforce their rights made them property grants. The lower barriers to acquisition and wide availability of the rights made them democratic, or perhaps I should say relatively democratic. Compared to government backing for elite-sponsored enterprises such as the Livingston Steamboat in Chapter 2, invention patterns after 1820 were more democratic. But when viewed from the perspective of a black inventor, or in many cases a woman inventor, the patent system was a piece with most other legal rights. It was off limits, out of reach. Patents were awarded to white citizens of even modest means, but until emancipation in 1865, a slave considered a non-citizen could not obtain a patent in his or her own name. The short-lived Confederate Patent Office did permit patents on slave-created inventions, however, but with the predictable caveat that the same person who owned the slave also had ownership of a slave-invented patent. If anything in this book is more than a rehash of prior histories, it is this: a deep dive into the relationship between patents and business enterprises. In the earliest period, patents and related government franchises often covered entire economic markets or even industries. Legal protection for a technology, in other words, translated often intentionally into an industry-wide exclusive franchisee. The best example is the various steamboat franchises and patents which gave legal rights not simply to a technology but to an actual market. These are covered in Chapter 2 in the section on courtier capitalism. In these franchises or privileges, the scope of the exclusive grant was tied not just to technical features but also to entire new technologies and hence the market that these technologies defined. Livingston's grant from the state of New York, for example, covered quite broadly the sole and exclusive right and privilege of making, using, and navigating all and every species or kinds of boats or watercraft which might be urged or impelled through the water by the force of fire or steam. A New York State court in a decision from 1812 even took pains while upholding the validity of a concurrent state franchise to distinguish the New York State grant from a true federal patent right. The respondent's van engine trying to break into the New York steamboat business show no patent, and the appellants, Livingston et al., have not obtained their grant as inventors of the steamboat, and therefore the privilege is totally unconnected with the patent power. It seems to be admitted that the US Congress was authorized to grant patents only to the inventor of the useful art. This was right in line with the pattern laid down in Great Britain in the early years of the patent system. The focus was on technologies conceived of as coexistive with the new markets they opened up. This betrayed a conception of state franchises as applying to a technology market industry triad. The goal as a policy matter was to confer exclusivity over the market that would be created and defined by a new technology. Though technological parameters were used to define the protected market, the focal point of the government franchise or privilege was to confer exclusivity over the market itself. Government and a well-connected private party combined forces under the auspices of a government grant to directly stimulate the development of a market for a new product type, such as the steamboat, whose diffusion and improvement was thought to produce self-evident advantages for society at large. The conception and scope of early privileges made them most often coexisted with the market for a new type of product or service. Although some post-grant transactions were likely contemplated, including perhaps various financing arrangements and exclusive regional operators or licensees, the market-wide scope of the right makes it unlikely that anyone imagined the right might form an input into a larger product or might be combined with other rights in a joint venture or any similar transactions. The right was thought of in an implicit way as akin to a permit to operate a business. Under the grant, the only permissible business of this type, as defined by the technology employed, patents, to put it simply, were meant to confer a right to operate not just a single business organization, but an entire type of business. It took time for this notion of patents to fade away. Signs of change began in the early 19th century, an era when large-scale automated textile factories began appearing on the banks of New England rivers. The authorization to raise capital and own assets on this scale came not in the form of a government franchise but in the form of a state corporate charter. These newly formed companies sometimes acquired patents, some of which were quite valuable. The large textile firms were in this respect a prototype for later companies. The textile firms accumulated multiple related patents on various machines, components, and systems used in their factories. They acquired and deployed patents as business assets, using them to maintain competitive advantage over certain features of textile production and to protect profit margins, so some of the firm's earnings could be plowed back into research on new and better machinery. One critique of invention patents originated in response to this trend: corporatization. It was said betrayed the democratic character of the patent system. Big companies displaced individual inventors as patent owners after 1880. According to this view, once patent ownership passed from individual inventors to large corporations, the patent system had abandoned its founding charter. Patents were converted from incentives aimed at individuals and small companies to a tool of corporate power and control. No doubt, the 19th century presented the patent system with numerous challenges, as described in depth in Chapter 4, but in my view, the corporatization critique depends on a distorted picture of the pre-corporate era. Patents, particularly those on valuable inventions, were from the start co-owned by investors, turned over to partnerships, and used as the central locus of networks of regional franchise owners. Patents were used as the scaffolding around which private enterprises were built. There is a persistent Jeffersonian myth surrounding patents. The idea of the small inventor creating a new technology and closely holding a patent to earn a profit. But this was never really the dominant pattern even in the earliest years of the system. It's true that patents did not become common corporate property until the late 19th century, but that's because there were very few corporations until then. And as mentioned, the private corporations that were chartered, such as textile manufacturing plants in Massachusetts, held many patents. Once the notion of a Jeffersonian golden age is set aside, it is easier to see that patents and patent ownership develop over time in keeping with the needs, requirements, and constraints of the changing national economy. They were like their cousins, federal debt and federal land patents, protean assets born from the new republic and intended to promote commerce and economic growth. Invention patents exemplified the democratic property strategy of the mid 19th century, but they were never a static presence in the American economy. From my perspective, the increase in corporate patent ownership in the late 19th century was more a fulfillment of patents law's founding charter than a betrayal of it. It was part of the move to much higher levels of capital investment, which in turn fed the growth of large scale corporate research. Corporate ownership did support increases in enterprise scale and scope, but it did not by itself inevitably produce industry spanning market monopolies. Finally, the emergence of patent related tactics as an aspect of competitive corporate strategy was not in itself anything new. Private enterprises prior to 1880 put patents into action in a number of ways: to structure an enterprise, to coordinate regional partners, to protect market share or profit margins, and so on. Patents are not only tools in the hands of large corporations, but they are also opportunities for small companies, especially new entrants, to gain upstart in a highly competitive industry. The durable role of patents in service of new firm entry continued even as ever larger patent portfolios raised concerns as a barrier to entry during the rise of antitrust enforcement. First, in the progressive era, that is 1910, and then the high point of antitrust enforcement after 1930. After the coming of the Federal Circuit in 1982, patents received a boost that was noticed by venture capitalists and other investors. Therefore, patents' place in the world of business changed again. They became important assets in the dynamic world of venture backed startup companies. Increased patent value also brought a familiar phenomenon, another wave of rent seeking litigation in the form of patent trolls presented major challenges after the late 1990s, but by 2020, many patent reforms had begun to do their work, following the same pattern as the late 19th century cycle of excessive litigation followed by reformist legal change. Litigation once again appeared to be in slight retreat, and the patent system seemed poised to return to a more constructive, if perhaps more modest, role in the American business enterprise. 1.1.3.1 An example of adaptive change. The law of patent assignments. Patents, as I said, provided the core kernel around which a series of private arrangements could be structured. They provided part of the legal infrastructure for private ordering. The following chapters are full of examples, but to illustrate what post-patent grant private ordering actually looks like and how patent doctrine facilitates that ordering, consider the example of patent assignments. Patent assignments made an important contribution to the financing of inventions and regional patent-based franchises from the earliest years of the patent system. Though the blunt purpose of assignments is to transfer an ownership interest, there were a few steps to making general assignment law adjust to the needs of early American inventive enterprise. So the rise of a distinct body of patent assignment law makes for a nice case study. The first step was to enable partial assignments of patent rights. In an era before corporations were common, partial ownership turned patent rights into something like corporate stock. In general, a partial patent assignment formed a co-ownership arrangement which gave each co-owner an undivided partial share in the entire patent right. Without a corporate structure, without even a partnership contract, a patent provided an off-the-rack organizational structure. An ownership and governance structure was created automatically in the form of co-ownership rules when part of a patent was assigned. Allocating partial ownership shares to investors is a good way to raise capital for overall operations. It was common from the very earliest days of the patent system for patents to issue to the inventor and an assignee, which signifies that the inventor drew an investor even before the patent grant. We will see this and many variations in the business uses of patent in the chapters ahead. Multi-tiered enterprises with patents broken into half interests, quarter interests, 30 seconds interests, etc. built around patent-based partnership agreements were very common. Partial owners both financed new technologies and, depending on the terms of patent partnership agreements, lent a hand to the management of the enterprise as well. The other type of partial assignment conferred ownership of an exclusive territory. Patent owners often assigned exclusive rights to limited regions such as Massachusetts only, or to only the cities of Boston, Cambridge, and Watertown. These made each regional assignee the sole owner of the patent in the assignee's limited region. Regional assignments, in effect, created franchises. A central patent ownership partnership granted exclusive territories to independent regional investor operators. A federal court procedural rule that grew up around this practice gave regional owners the right to enforce their patent interest in their exclusive territory. Thus, the owner of the rights to Massachusetts had standing to sue anyone infringing the patent in a federal court in Massachusetts.
Shriyam Saraswatim Gaurim Ganesham Skandamishwaram Brahmanam Vahanimindradi Vasudevam Namamyaham.